Greetings, friends. Shalom, and welcome here to. I guess this isn't necessarily an episode of the Watchdog. This is more of a. I don't know exactly what you would call it. I guess just a discussion. It's just going to be something we're throwing on the YouTube channel. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I am joined here today with Adam Kokesh of Adam versus the Man. Ran for president of the United States here on the Libertarian Party ticket in 2020. Actually, by the way, fun fact. We did an interview about that particular thing roughly a year back, if you guys are interested in that. But very happy to have you guys here with us today. We're going to be discussing the United States Constitution. Interestingly enough, this will be a different conversation for a lot of you guys. A lot of you guys are probably thinking, oh, yeah, so it's a constitutional conversation. So is it good or do we need more restrictions kind of thing? Not the case, actually. Today, we're going to be discussing whether or not the Constitution itself is actually too restrictive, or put in a better way, is it a good thing overall for human liberty? So I'll be taking the affirmative on that. Mr. Kokesh will be taking the, I don't really want to call it the negative on that, but the opposing position, I guess we'll say. And we're going to have a nice friendly dialogue and see what happens. So I want to go ahead and give the floor to you, Mr. Kokesh. Introduce yourself and let's see how this goes.
Well, thank you, Jay, for inviting me for this special edition of your show. Debate special version, but no, I'm not taking the negative here. I'm taking the historically accurate side of the conversation. Was the Constitution, or is the Constitution, good for human liberty? Now, you could re-ask that question. Is a document that is designed to create authority and violate human rights and give a government the power to take away your freedom, somehow in some backwards, backhanded, magical thinking, imaginary, historical delusion, textbook propaganda way, perhaps, possibly, could it be analyzed as having a good effect for liberty? And in trying to take the affirmative in a devil's advocate kind of way, the only way that I could consider the Constitution good for liberty is that it has created a mythology of liberty. And at least a mythology of liberty is better than a mythology of comfortable slavery or safe servitude or something like that. So to go back historically, how did we get the Constitution and why was it so bad from the very beginning? Well, before the current Constitution, I assume, CJ, that we're talking about the current Constitution of the United States of America as opposed to the legal Constitution of the United States of America, which is still the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were in effect when the Constitutional Convention was called as we know it today. And the Articles of Confederation required unanimous consent from the 13 independent states for any modification of that document. George Washington isn't actually the first president of the United States. Even that is a dangerous lie, rewriting of history. Depending on how you want to count it, George Washington is the 10th president of the United States and can only be described as the first illegal constitutional president under the coup that is the current Constitution, which was illegally ratified under the rules of the Articles of Confederation, specifically that unanimous consent clause. And what happened was that in order for this coup to be completed, they had to bully a lot of people to go along with it. And of course, it was more nominal than realistic. You know, the preamble says, we the people of the United States. We the people? You mean we the rich white men who happen to be in the room right now, and we're able to bully people into submission to go along with our plans to create a new central warfare, welfare, central banking fueled state. And so the Constitution, in order to appease those who objected it, included the Bill of Rights. And they said that, like, hey, look, we're going to take on all this new power, but we promise we won't abuse it. We'll respect your rights. And look, we even wrote your rights down to show you what rights of yours we won't abuse. But even just in doing so, they turned them into government-granted privileges as opposed to rights. Or rather, they tried to make it work that way and claim this new authority. And what that authority was, and it's a false authority, obviously not truly from the consent of the people, as you know, the direct Declaration of Independence itself declares that governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Well, if there's no consent of the governed, there are no just powers. And here, there was no consent. This was a central authority that was forced on the new country. And as it lays out in Article 8, or Section 8, the powers of Congress are simply unethical powers. You know, that says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes. Well, taxation is theft, right? It says, you know, we have the power to steal from you. Well, if I go to a restaurant, I write down on a napkin, I can steal your car and you can't do anything about it. That doesn't magically give me the authority to go to the parking lot and carjack you. It's still wrong. And what that means when it's wrong is that it's against freedom. Freedom is what you have, or liberty, when no one is forcing their will on you in any way. Or just to go to the dictionary, liberty, the power to do as one pleases, freedom from physical restraint, freedom from arbitrary or despotic control, the positive enjoyment of various social, political, or economic rights and privileges, the power of choice. And all of these powers taken on by the Constitution take away your liberty. When they say we can steal from you, that means that you don't have the liberty to do what you want with the money that you earn or the stuff that you own legally, reliably. The power to borrow money on the credit of the United States, that is to sell you into debt as a taxpayer, as a tax slave. For people born into America today, your share of the national debt is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's intergenerational child abuse, to force you to pay for stuff that you never had a say in. To regulate commerce, that means the government is going to regulate those things. You don't have the choice as an individual. You don't have the liberty to determine that for yourself. To coin money, naturalization. I mean, we can go into this as we get into the debate point by point about all of these things, but obviously reinforcing direct slavery with the 3/5 rule, encouraging, or rather instituting a system of intellectual property, which is obviously anti-freedom. The creation of standing armies that the founders were against, to say you're going to be subject to a defense monopoly instead of being able to provide for your own defense. All of these things are very anti-freedom. And if you want to make the case that the rhetoric of freedom, the lip service that was used to justify it, might have some positive counter-propaganda effect, yeah, I'm open to hearing that case, but there's no way that you can say that is on the scale of promoting freedom in any ways, in any way that competes with all of the ways the Constitution has destroyed freedom. And that's my opener.
All righty, and thank you very much for that. And so now I'm going to go back, and just so you guys, the audience here, are aware, the openers are a little bit, shall we say, flexible. Sometime between 5 and 10 minutes is kind of the idea, and then we're kind of just going to go into a general back and forth after this.
Yeah, Jay, if I may say one more thing here, then, sort of to finish out the introduction, the setup of this debate and this video as a whole. I really prefer debates like this, where it's not two people coming together going, let me use you to make you look silly and show the audience how wrong you are. But, you know, I feel that better than that, you know, you and I are coming into this conversation with a spirit of, well, we've come to different conclusions. Let's compare notes and see if we can both learn something.
Absolutely. And even to take it a step further, I must say, just to kind of, take this as you will, but one of my original experiences getting into liberty in politics and actually becoming a firm supporter of it, just, you know, little anecdote, was actually Washington, D.C., Adam Kokesh, if you recall. That I thought that was like, because I was, well, let's see, that was 2014, right?
2008. You mean my speech at the Revolution March for Ron Paul?
No, actually, I mean when you got arrested in D.C. With the firearm.
Oh, okay. Because when you say arrested in D.C., that alone doesn't narrow it down much. Yes, with the firearm, that was that was 2014.
2014. Yeah. So I was 16 at that time, and I thought that was just the most like awesome thing any quote unquote political cultural figure had ever done. So just to give that little anecdote, this is definitely not a battle of enemies, in my opinion. You know what I mean? But at any rate. So let's go ahead and jump into why I believe the Constitution is good for human liberty. So there are a couple things I want to address as kind of philosophical points, points that we'll definitely have to discuss and see if they are proper presuppositions in the first place, but points that nonetheless I think are vital to this discussion. Point number one is that absolute liberty does not actually breed absolute liberty. And what do I mean by that? Well, oftentimes people will see things like the term anarchy, and anarchy is often used interchangeably with anarchism, although that is certainly not accurate, just for the record. Anarchy is more of a state of society. Anarchism is an actual legitimate political ideology. But nonetheless, what we tend to have when we have an absolute liberty is something akin to what we would consider to be an anarchy, right? Where there is essentially no rules and people can do everything that they wish. And some people might come together voluntarily, but some people might decide they don't want to come together voluntarily, to accept certain other people's or certain ideas or so on and so forth. Because of this, there's been philosophers throughout the centuries, dating all the way back to the Romans and Athenians, in fact, who have said that liberty cannot be separated from law. You need to have proper law and order in order to have functioning liberty, because if you do not have proper law and order, then eventually you will have individuals who are stealing the liberty of other individuals. And this is in things that are obvious in some points, like, murder, rape, theft, so on and so forth. But they can be in things that are kind of not so obvious that we kind of need to discuss sometimes. And of course, I'm sure they'll come up in this conversation. You already brought up intellectual property rights. I think that'll be a pretty interesting thing to go back and forth on once we get that opportunity. So I'll kind of leave that there. But nonetheless, you see that if you have literally no law whatsoever, right, then what eventually starts occurring is people start actually, abusing the fact that they have higher power, whether because they have more money or more resources or what have you, or sometimes just being anarchic and abusing their human given abilities to do things like rob, steal, and so on and so forth, right? Now, what is typically the solution to that is, of course, some form of written, documented law and a form of functioning government. What the founding fathers had decided before the Constitution, around the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, was that there needed to be a philosophical grounding for them to make the claim all men have certain inalienable rights. As a result of this, you had what was a pretty interesting conclusion considering the differentiation of religious opinion, but what we ended up finding is a grounding of rights as inalienable because they were endowed by the Creator, right? And this is an interesting thing, of course, because Benjamin Franklin was an atheist, Thomas Jefferson was a deist. There's argument about whether or not George Washington was a Christian, but the point is they all did end up agreeing when it came to the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And the reason they did that is because you do need something to ground your liberty in philosophically. You see, if you just say humans have certain inalienable rights, my immediate question, if I want to play the devil's advocate, is why? Who says? I honestly, and let's just once again play the hypothetical, I think that Socrates wasn't 100% wrong when he said that maybe voting should be given to a certain select people who actually know what they're talking about. Now, again, I'm playing the devil's advocate, but if you can kind of see the logic there, right? There's a lot of people who are ill-informed, easily propagandized upon, so on and so forth, right? And Socrates saw that and realized the demigods show up, boom, just like that, right? And so he said, maybe we should actually limit people's right to vote. Well, logically, that makes sense. And if all you have to say, which is what a lot of people throughout the past, by the way, I'm not leveling this accusation against Mr. Kokesh, but what people like the Constitution Party and the Libertarian Party, even people I support, right, what they have had to say in the past is simply, well, humans just have liberty. Well, why do humans have liberty? If you say humans have liberty because all animals have liberty, well, all animals have liberty in the sense that they literally maim and eat each other. So I don't think we really want that form of liberty. If you want to say we all have liberty because we've just all agreed that we all have liberty, well, then what if we all agree that we don't all have liberty at some point in time, right? And that's, of course, the dangers of mob rule. So these two fundamental points, I think, absolutely need to be recognized. Number one, law cannot be separated from liberty. And number two, liberty needs to be grounded in some logical, philosophical thing. Now, you may be wondering, but that's the Declaration of Independence, CJ, so what does that have to do with the Constitution? Well, I believe you cannot separate the two. I know there are scholars out there who will suggest that you can, but considering they were written and signed by the self-same people and the self-same government, I think that it is impossible to separate the interpretation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. To put it a different way, if I were to take, as a religious scholar, the New Testament and try to separate that from the Old Testament, that wouldn't make any sense. And a lot of scholars do try to do that, but that doesn't make any sense. The fact of the matter is the New Testament was written in the context of an already existing Old Testament written by people affirming the self-same faith. And likewise, in this, we have an even stronger example because it's not people affirming the self-same ideology, but the very self-same people who affirmed that ideology and indeed created the document Declaration of Independence itself. What the Constitution gave us is a document that codified those rights that we had kind of vaguely established in the Declaration of Independence and said, this is what they are, this is why they cannot, regardless of what institution decides to come out against them, ever be replaced. They are inalienable, so on and so forth. And also they, of course, allowed us to do certain things like defend our nation, establish a functioning economy, so on and so forth with that. But I'm sure we'll get more into that with a back and forth. So in conclusion, what I would just like to say is I believe that law and liberty must go hand in hand in what could kind of be termed a balance, for lack of a better term, not to get too like esoteric or anything like that. But I don't think you can have one truly existing without the other. Law doesn't mean anything if there's no liberty to preserve, and liberty is not actually liberty if there's no law to protect it. And that's where I would concede.
All right, Jay, you gave me a lot to jump into there. So much wrong that conflicts with my notes here, so to speak. I like your point about the general foundation of liberty being rooted in God-given or natural rights and really fundamental to our understanding of freedom and how we employ it in society. Did you say that George Washington signed the Declaration or was behind it?
Well, so not exactly. I might have given that impression, but what I was saying is that the people who signed the Declaration were the same people who signed the Constitution in many instances. People like Jefferson and James Madison.
Okay, so there were. Do you know how many signed the Constitution and how many signed the Declaration?
I believe 13 signed the Constitution, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know how many signed the Declaration, like off the top of my head. No, in fact, I only know a couple of the names, John Hancock and so on and so forth, right?
Well, actually, it was 39 people who signed the Constitution. And they were, I believe, then representatives of the 13 colonies, right? That would make sense. 13 times 3 would be 39. And it was according to this is Reader's Digest, pretty credible source. Only 39 men, and they were all white men and property owners at that, actually signed the most famous legal document in the world. Most people believe there were more signers, and most Americans probably also believe these 10 myths about the Constitution, but we can save that. Why only 39? First of all, one of the states that was bullied into ratifying the Constitution was Rhode Island, and they didn't send any delegates. And despite a total of 70 attendees, only 55 delegates attended the majority of the Constitutional Convention meetings, and there were never more than 46 present at any one time. And as to the Declaration of Independence, George Washington was not one of the signers. And it really is important to make a distinction between these two groups of men. The ones who signed the Declaration of Independence signed a death warrant from the king with their own hand. They signed a document that said, if we lose this war, we're going to get killed. We're going to be executed by the king. The framers are the ones who came in, 1776, 1789, 13 years later and said, hey, you know how we don't have our super class being empowered by a strong central government and a military and a central bank, and we don't get to tax people. When we were in Europe, we just wrote decrees as the oligarchies behind the monarchies, and we were able to tax people like it was. We can't do that. We need more government power here in the United States. So no, again, the myth that you're using there to bolster your case, Jay, is just historically inaccurate. Now, the main point that I want to address here is, what you talk about with liberty and law. And I think you're confusing the idea of law and written law. And, we know about scientific law, we know about moral law, ethical law, the laws of physics, things like that. And there is a basic law of freedom. It's called the natural law. And it's respect for self-ownership. If you hurt somebody, you take responsibility for it. You make your victims whole. And you said, without law, people would abuse power. No, well, written, when you take natural law and you write it down in a form that says, I have the right to violate natural law, you are inherently abusing power, or at least creating the words that you're going to use as the excuse to abuse that power. And so you have confused, I think, in your argument, written law and natural law versus voluntary systems. When you say without law, there is no liberty, well, only if you define law properly as the natural law and respect for individual rights. Now, this also doesn't cover what you mentioned here with voluntary systems. And, you use the ancient example of Socrates and say, voting should be trusted to people who can handle it. Well, yeah, that's fine. And you can make the case 100% that society is better off when it entrusts certain decisions to certain people. But entrust is the key word, not invite people to force their will on you. And so this is how the economy works. This is how free markets work, that we can buy all of our whatever goods and services for one company, and whoever's in charge of that company gets to decide without, our help, how those goods and services are made and provided. And there's that specialization of labor inherent with that. But that saying that might create better delivery of goods and services or a stronger economy if people who are good at making decisions are empowered to make those decisions, that's not saying that makes it okay to then force those decisions on people. Because what you're saying, if you apply that the way that you're applying that argument to government, is yes, not only should we have only one company make cars in America, we should all trust our car making manufacturing decisions to the one person who's best at it, and the rest of us should have little to no say in it. What you're saying is that company should be able to force every American to buy the car that they make. When you say that some people should be trusted to make social organization or governmental decisions that other people should be left out of, yeah, that's fine. But we all, in order to have freedom, have to have the right to opt out and choose what voluntary systems we might be a part of. Having, what you describe as anarchy, as chaos, certainly would be a problem. But absolute freedom doesn't mean no government or no systems of government or no complex social systems. It just means that they're voluntary, that they're ethical, that no one is forced by physical violence, coercion, the threat of violence into those systems. So just to go back to the first point here, you said that like the Constitution versus the Declaration, that you can't separate them like the Old Testament from the New Testament. Well, yeah, you can. And the history of the Old Testament versus the New Testament is pretty clearly documented. To see how the New Testament and Old Testament really were cobbled together from the disparate books of their components into the Bible as we know it today by the Council of Nicaea as a religious power grab. Yeah, it's actually very important to separate these documents and understand their historical stories. And in terms of, can you separate the Old Testament from the New Testament? Yeah, my tribe has been doing it from the beginning. We're called the Jews.
Well, so I have a couple things to say on that, and I appreciate a lot of those points for sure. So first thing I do want to point out, I definitely did mix some things up. So I want to go ahead and correct the record on a couple things. So there were 6 total signers of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution at the same time. Jefferson, I can't remember if he's one of the 6, but I do know that he vocally supported the Constitution, and in fact would even talk about how, and of course Jefferson being the big writer of the Declaration of Independence, that's I would say a fairly important factor. I am drawing a blank as to whether or not he is one of those 6. I'm not 100% sure, so maybe you can even correct that for me. But I do know, in fact, even in 1791, he had come out very strongly saying that the Constitution's bulwark against having a centralized bank was one of its greatest strong suits, and he even went as far as to be the 3rd president of the United States, founding the very first political party, right? So, and when I say that the self-same people who supported the Declaration of Independence supported the Constitution, in a lot of instances, that is the case. For example, George Washington is not a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jefferson. I just looked it up. Jefferson didn't sign the Constitution, according to this article. Okay. Again, Reader's Digest. Only 2 presidents signed the Constitution: George Washington and James Madison.
Yeah, and I think James Madison is like the primary pen of the Constitution. So, kind of the same way Jefferson is of the Declaration, if I'm not mistaken. But nonetheless, right, so it is important to note, though, that Jefferson was a supporter of this document. He thought it was a way to codify his ideas and the ideas others had added onto it in the Declaration of Independence. When we say certain things like not being able to separate law from liberty, you make the point that, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily preempt any of these voluntary systems. I think to a certain extent, voluntarism needs to be properly defined. So just as an example, I would agree that bodies do need to have the right to leave. Like, for example, if the state of Texas were to decide it wanted to secede from the Union, I do believe it has that right. And in fact, a proper and originalist interpretation of the Constitution would absolutely warrant that, which is why the Supreme Court had to rule after the United States Civil War that such a thing was unconstitutional. And by the way, they ruled incorrectly in that. I know there is a lot of people who believe that the Supreme Court is infallible, but that is certainly not the case. So I think the constitutional framers would think that actually secession is definitely something that is vital. In fact, it's the very right that they used to remove themselves from the British government in the first place. And in fact, when you see some examples of rebellions from that time, you'll notice that they're never rebellions like this. For example, the Whiskey Rebellion, which George Washington had to deal with, was a rebellion of people who weren't trying to secede or overthrow anything. If anything, it was more like an organized riot to try and get something done as far as the removing of this whiskey tax, which, by the way, I would just like to point out, Washington, being the honorable man that he was, pardoned quite a few of the people who rioted against him at that point in time, even after beating them in armed combat, leading from the front lines. Just want to point that out. When people say mythological figures can't possibly have existed, it's like we have historically documented mythological figures. I don't know what you mean. But at any rate, that's neither here nor there. Now, we get to the point which I think is most vital on this, because to a certain extent, I know we'll go back and forth on those other things, but we talk about the separation of the Declaration of Independence from the Constitution. I think that is kind of the most important facet here, because whether or not we agree on the voluntaristic styles of government, or whether or not you can separate law from liberty and things like that, which to be fair, I think to a certain extent you disagree with my interpretation of that, but I think you would agree the law does definitely need to happen in order for liberty to be properly maintained in some form, at least, whether it's a voluntary law or a coerced law, I think. Is what the difference would be between us. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, of course. But you mentioned...
But it would be definitional. I mean, if you have a society that really respects freedom as part of the paradigm and has institutions that enforce property rights and respect for individual rights, you don't need law or to have it written down necessarily. So I kind of disagree with you semantically there. But then in that world, there would be other, codification of other rules and social standards that would be voluntarily entered into. So, yeah, if you want, it's a bit of a rhetorical distinction.
Well, and maybe to a certain extent, we should split those three and maybe kind of address each one-on-one and kind of a back and forth, because they might be, we have the time to do it, so might as well.
Sure.
So let's start with the first one. Let's start with the separation of, I was going to go into the separation of the Declaration and the Constitution, but let's start with separation of law and liberty first, because I think that's the most fundamental of these. So how in a voluntaristic society if it's strictly voluntaristic, if you have every individual voluntarily agreeing, right? How do you account for things that we know as a matter of fact will happen just sociologically speaking? For example, there's numerous sociopaths who exist, and there's a certain segment of that population of sociopaths who does not actually want to, hamper down those particular sociopathic impulses. I would say, and I think a lot of people who are constitutionalists would agree with me, that it is the function of the government at that point, the government, of course, elected by the people, to take those people and to remove them from society in some way. And we can argue about what those punishments should be, whether, obviously people say things, exile, prison, there's death penalties, there's all this other stuff that you can argue about. But the point is, if they're in the society, people's liberty is being violated, and we need to remove them from the society in some way.
Hold on, okay, so now you're using some very confusing framing, and I don't know if it's deliberate or not, but when you say sociopaths, that's kind of an internal state. Even the psychological community can't agree on diagnostic criteria for sociopath that says this person is a sociopath and this person isn't. But even then, a medical designation would not be an appropriate way to deal with someone as a member of society. So when you say there are these sociopaths out there, it's kind of like, be afraid of people. There are bad people out there. What do we do about bad people? Don't we have to get rid of bad people? You said remove from society. And it's like, well, hey, this is the kind of imprecise language that government would use to justify its power, not the kind that a rational person would look at analyzing a social problem. So when you say sociopaths, I would challenge you to redefine that in terms of people who X or when X happens, because you said this in your premise to that setup of that question, that a society, certain things we know are going to happen, and then you go, there are sociopaths. Well, I don't care if there are sociopaths. If they don't hurt anybody, you'd be a totally functioning, nap-respecting psychopath even. And if that's who you are, I don't have any right to remove you from my society or from any artificial collective.
Well, and to be a little clear, I guess, then, so let me replace the word sociopath with, let's say, somebody who is diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, because that's a diagnosable personality disorder.
Doesn't matter. Same problem.
Well,
subjective
hold on,
opinion analysis. Like, does that give you a right to violate someone's right because a doctor said they have a personality?
Absolutely not. But notice I did specify when I was saying there are certain segments of, and I used sociopath then, but let's replace it with antisocial. But there are certain segments of the antisocial population who will choose not to remove themselves from those particular urges and will commit certain crimes, things like assault.
So then after the internal and the diagnoses don't matter at all. It's only the behavior that matters.
That it doesn't matter in the sense that the government needs to go after antisocial people. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is those people exist. Certain segments of those populations will, of course, be more inclined to violence and may act on those. And once they act on those, because that's an inevitability, right? We know antisocial personality disorder exists. And by the way, just for the record, there are plenty of criminals who don't have any problems. The point I'm making in the antisocial personality disorder is that is just a medical fact, right? We can't do anything about that at this current point in time. So since we know that...
As someone with a degree in psychology, I would have a lot of problems with that statement, but go ahead.
All right, and I certainly would acknowledge that. But the thing that I'm trying to say here is we know there are certain segments of the population who will commit violent crimes because that will exist in any population. And we can't preemptively do anything to them. That's certainly not what I'm arguing for. But once they commit those violent acts, they are now violating the liberty of other people. Right? They are violating the liberty of a woman to walk to the store at 3 a.m., for example, without fear for her life or her sexual freedom. They are violating the right of, say, there was a guy just shot the other day walking his daughter, and of course, there's a lot of modern political context that goes into that. Leaving all of that aside,
did you just say that a woman has a right to walk to the store without being afraid?
Yeah, absolutely.
That I have a right. So, because if you take away my peace of mind, because that's just out of line with physical reality here. First of all, whether you are afraid or not is an internal function of your brain. You don't have a right to say that anybody else has to do or not do something else because you might be afraid. That's a bad excuse for violating someone's rights. I could say I have a right to not be afraid of traveling from here to Washington, and therefore every police officer has to get off the roads because police scare me. Like, no, that's not a right. Or I have to, I have a right to travel, to the corner store without fear. If I have a right to travel to the corner store without fear, well, I'm afraid of red cars. When I'm out, all red cars have to be off the road. No, I mean, obviously, that is not a foundation of rights.
Well, to be fair, though, we do have to take this into the context of what I'm describing, right? When I'm saying that there's these people who commit certain crimes, and of course you listed areas like, or I list areas, right, like Chicago and things like that, right? There are areas in the world where it is more reasonable to assume as a woman walking out at 3 a.m. that you will be assaulted than it is reasonable to assume that you will not be assaulted. And that is completely contrary to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
Right, well, places like that happen to all live under constitutional governments. What do you know?
Well, to be fair, places like that all happen to live under quite liberal governments, and I would argue progressivism is literally anti-constitutional, but that's an argument that's kind of separated from our field.
The Constitution itself is progressive. The Constitution, if you mean like by making government bigger, the Constitution, as Lysander Spooner said, has either failed to prevent the government we have or authorized it, and either way is unfit to exist. But Jay, you're having trouble, it seems, getting to the heart of your challenge here, which is that there are going to be bad actors in society who, for whatever motivation, are going to violate individual rights. And you're saying, I think the case that you're trying to get to is that written law in the form of a constitution that authorizes a government is one way that society can effectively deal with these bad actors. And if that's where you're going with this, I would make the counterpoint that you cannot create a system that is inherently criminal and expect it to have an overall anti-crime effect. So while government taking a monopoly on justice and public safety services might lead to certain good outcomes in certain areas, the overall effect is, by definition, an increase in criminality. So to say, well, we need a system that protects us from thieves, but let's let it steal from us. Well, now everybody's a victim of thievery. If instead we let people defend themselves instead of creating authority that's impossible to defend yourself against, then we're going to have more crimes. But if I may I want to do one more general rebuttal, and if you want to get to the other 2 points. You keep going back to these appeals to authority. Not in not a single thing that you have said so far have I heard you make a case where the Constitution has actually, in any meaningful way, increased liberty. You're making this vague sort of general, underlying statement that says, we dealt with criminals, individual criminals, with government. You'd have to show statistics that say, well, is there a lessening or an increase? And if you count real crimes and locking someone up for a victimless crime like smoking pot or not paying taxes or violating some regulation, that's a crime committed by government under color of law. That is an increase in criminality. You said Texas has the right to secede, right? Well, states don't have rights. Only individual human beings have rights. So you say they have the right to secede. Well, do they? I'm pretty sure the federal government, when states wanted to secede, said, screw you, we're going to kill you. That's how the Civil War started. Now, obviously, there was a lot of slavery tied up in that. And the mythology of the Civil War was that Abraham Lincoln was the great emancipator. And of course, again, along with the Constitution, victors write the history. So that, Abraham Lincoln cared about equality. No, you look at the quotes about Abraham Lincoln, black people. Holy crap, he was one of the most offensive, obscene racists of the time. So the idea that, the secession is appropriate here, respected here, no, the Constitution in and of itself has created the mechanism to deny states the right to secede. Even now, with California proposing secession, it's encountering a number of constitutional challenges. But more importantly, does the individual have the right to secede? And if the individual right to secede is not respected, then you cannot be said to have a voluntary or ethical or pro-freedom or freedom-respecting system at all. Now, you also said George Washington, and I just side note, little historical side note here just for fun, because you said George Washington had to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion. That's like saying that the resistance was something that Darth Vader had to deal with. Poor guy, all these people who wanted to be free, he had to go and suppress their freedom and kill a bunch of them and make sure that that rebellion was suppressed and that the people went back into the arms of the empire. No, it's not a good case for the Constitution respecting freedom to say that it was used to put down a tax revolt.
Well, to be fair, that anecdote was just more about a little bit of fun facts about Washington himself, not more about. So, and I do want to address a couple points there, though, because so when we talk about this separation of law and liberty, I think to a certain extent, what the problem we're running into here is, on one end, so you are making the point of criminality of a system, and I think that is something certainly to be addressed. I think that the Constitution gives us the ability to address that internally. For example, we did not give black people the right to vote. We then had the ability, using the constitutional framework as given, to give black people the right to vote. There was also certain things that I...
Hold on, you have a right to vote? You have a right to vote? How does that work? Is that a natural right? Does God come down and say, here's your ballot, you have a right to vote? No,
well, that's a little bit more of a philosophical question for sure. I would argue, and this is certainly as a religious scholar, something that I would, scholar, I'm a layperson, of course. But this is something that I would certainly say is, I don't think you can possibly ground liberty in anything other than the existence of an omnipotent creator deity. I think that you get things that end up sounding identical to that if you try to argue against, for example, now, and this is a little bit, off of the parameters of our conversation, but just to give a brief example, Plato would talk about things like platonic objects, you know what I mean? And when I hear about platonic objects justifying things like art and liberty and love and morality and stuff like that, it's like you're basically saying God, but it's an object rather than a person. It exists in another realm, eternal, so that it can come into our realm and present, you know what I mean? It's like, so I think natural rights are, and I don't say this insultingly, I just simply say this in a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek fashion. It's a little bit hilarious to me because nature does not care for anything at all. It doesn't care about the rocks nor the tigers nor anything at all. You know what I mean? It just does not give a damn. It's very cruel, in fact. And to quote a band, just to kind of use a pop culture reference, Tool says, the universe is hostile, so impossible, devour to survive, so it is, so it's always been. Facts, right? Those are facts. And I think we need to acknowledge.
All right, duly noted, Jay. For the purpose of this conversation, though, you would take my position of, at least for this conversation, of accepting that different people have different frameworks for rights that are inherent in our humanity. At least we can respect that some people say rights are inherent in humanity. You might say, well, that's because of God, but that doesn't affect your respect for those rights in that individual.
Well, exactly. And actually, one thing I would even point out on that is, if you affirm, regardless of why those rights are inherent, maybe it's God, maybe it's a platonic object, maybe it's natural law, regardless, if you affirm that they're inherent, you can't then affirm that, oh, well, because you don't agree with my particular worldview, you don't have those liberties, right? And that's one of the things I've always wanted to point out to people. In other words, if you don't affirm the existence of a God, that doesn't mean that you have any less liberty than me, because my worldview dictates we all have that liberty regardless of what we actually believe, including the liberty to believe what we want. But nonetheless, it is a little bit of a tangent. You look like you were about to say something. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, your example of slavery and black voting rights, it doesn't really address the heart of the anti-freedom nature of the system. And, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. The system is controlled and manipulated by the same super class that manipulates governments all over the world. And if the way that they keep their racket going is make a better illusion of inclusion, that doesn't change the reality that illusion is distracting from. And what you have is your system. What you're saying is like, look, we have an evil system, but because it can change and become less evil, it's not evil. And it's like, no, it's still an evil system. At the time that black people were fighting to help end slavery or fighting for voting rights or civil rights, they were still being subjected to some of the greatest evils on earth, of subjugation, of brutality, of lynchings, and lynchings where the lynchers were protected by government. No, and government-sponsored lynchings in the war on drugs, in false, kangaroo courts where black people didn't have the same due process rights that white people did. I don't think that example comes anywhere close to justifying the original evil system that you're saying that point is a part of. Did I lose you? Are you there, Jay? Looks like it's still recording, but you're frozen. I'm gonna hang up and call back.
Alrighty, so and to kind of respond there, so I think there are a couple things that certainly need to be pointed out. For example, I would quote Frederick Douglass in saying that the Constitution, the Declaration, and July 4th are all kind of this, and really this is something that we've kind of had as a motif throughout our history. So it's been, of course, repeated by numerous people and replacing different concepts and institutions and so on and so forth that they were discussing, but that it's an ideal for us to attain, not necessarily a perfect system, because we are imperfect men. And I do think that that is something that certainly needs to be granted. It is a very important thing that we have a system that is able to be self-correcting. For example, giving African Americans, giving women, so on and so forth, the right to vote. There are a lot of systems out there that don't have that self-correction at all. In fact, they only get progressively worse. We see examples of the United States occasionally getting worse. We also see examples of that time. Sometimes it gets better from when it got worse. Just as a perfect example, we often think what we're experiencing right now is unprecedented in terms of how tyrannical our government has gotten and how kind of insane the populace is getting. 1860s, 1850s, very much the same. And yet we improved from that. And eventually it got worse again during the progressive era, but we improved. And it got worse again with FDR, but we improved. And it's kind of a cycle that we're going to have to continuously go through if we want to maintain the republic. But the thing that I would point out in that is not only is it beneficial that it's self-correcting, but it doesn't in the end, because it's had flaws, disprove that idea that we do need coercive law to deal with criminal actors, including political criminal actors, by the way, because the Constitution, if properly understood, does definitely allow us to go after government officials, right? That's certainly the case. I know that there was argument at the time about whether or not you could go after people like the president, and of course there's argument to the now about that as well. I think it's nonsense to say you can't go after an elected official, but that's not necessarily here nor there. The point is, right, that this constitutional framework set up a law that was specifically dedicated, A, to protecting the people militarily speaking, because that is something that, of course, is required. All the other nations don't agree with us, right? And therefore, some of them may or may not want to be our enemies. We can't proactively attack them, and I am very much on board with your peace activism in that sense. There's no reason to be in Iraq, Afghanistan, so on, right? But when we're bombed, right, like assuming the story of Pearl Harbor is 100% accurate, because I know there's argument about whether or not it was, but assuming it was, if we're bombed, we need to be able to defend ourselves and defend the people of Hawaii when they are inevitably invaded by the invasion coming forward. Of course, that's been abused, but that is why we need to be vigilant as Americans, using the powers that have been given to us by this Constitution to improve upon those institutions when they go out to others, right? But we do need that military to defend ourselves, to ensure that, a woman does have a right not to be raped, bare minimum, right? A man has a right to bare minimum. You mentioned intellectual property, but if I'm a big, multi-million-dollar corporation and some guy gives me his book because, and he's worked on this for the last 5 years and he's really proud of it, and this guy just takes it and he gives it to one of his cronies, and that crony gets to make millions while this other guy has to go starve, I would say that's a pretty good argument for intellectual. rights as well, right? People aren't allowed to just steal ideas from people in certain instances. And of course, that has to be taken with context. There's some ideas that you can't trademark or copy. A lot of context in all of these things. But the general rules still do apply, that the law is required to maintain these liberties, just like the law is required to maintain freedom from aggressive powers. And then the last thing I would point out is, economically speaking, the law is required to make sure that you even have the ability to trade with somebody in the first place, because government institutions will prop up regardless, right? It's going to happen. We saw this little syndicate in Seattle, right? Chaz or Chop or whatever they decided to call themselves. And within 2 days, they had leaders emerging, because it's just the natural way that human beings operate. I think the longest lived anarchist collective was a total of 3 years. Now, of course, you would argue that we would need voluntary systems, of course. But my point in saying that is just that these systems of governance get never set up when people want, even when people are trying to actively avoid them. And so if you have a completely voluntaristic system, these systems eventually come to rise to power. They're using whatever dollar they're using. You're using whatever dollar you guys are trying to consider yourself the same socio-political group or cultural group or what have you, but you can't even buy or sell each other's toilet paper because you don't know how each other's economic system works, right? They have different rules than you do. They have different currency than you do, so on and so forth. We even have problems with that in our own federalistic system. Imagine how much work it would be if it was 50 or 50 plus individual currencies, which is a problem we did actually have when the Articles of Confederation was originally enacted. And I would say for these three things, economy, military, and just preservation of human liberty in general, law cannot be separated from liberty at all. Economic liberty is a form of liberty. Liberty against foreign oppressors is a form of liberty. And of course, liberty against man is also a form of liberty. We wrap all that up with our fourth and final thing that the Constitution tries to protect our liberty against, and that is the United States government, right? Because we need liberty, and I agree with you on that, of course, against governments, which is why we have the right to bear arms, which is why we have the freedom of speech, which is why we have been given the right to vote. We have separation of powers, which those agree, if you want to argue they're not respected in the modern day, 100% true. But they have been respected in the past, and we can ensure that they're respected in the future by having a bill and popular. And I would concede there, because I've been kind of long-winded, that little rant, but
all right, Jay, I've been taking notes. You ready? We're gonna go point by point here.
All right.
One of your criteria, or one of your criticisms of other governments, is they get progressively worse. How else would you describe the growth of government, and the federal government in particular in the United States, other than getting progressively worse every single day? You look at the chart of the size of government growing, it is exponential, unparalleled. The Constitution has not created a system different and fundamentally from any of the other government systems around the world that grow progressively worse. Now, you said the system is self-correcting, and it's true. There are self-corrections. And you would say, well, the mafia can change its policies too. The mafia self-corrects. That doesn't make it any better. That doesn't make it not a fundamentally criminal organization. And when you look at society as a whole, should we be able to self-correct problems? Yeah, absolutely. What does government do? It limits our ability to self-correct. It slows down our corrections when we see that they need to be made. Instead of changing things right away or as fast as we logistically can with market-based solutions, with political-based solutions, politicians are entrenched for a term of years, and our corrections are put off until the next election, if we're lucky, to be able to actually change out the corrupt politicians with something other than a group of other corrupt politicians. You also said that you want to maintain the republic. I thought the goal here was liberty, not the maintenance of a tyrannical system. Now, if the republic were a voluntary system, I'd say, okay, sure, let's maintain the republic. But why would you want to maintain something that is inherently anti-freedom? Now, military protection. Now, I could go off for an hour on how having a military makes us less safe. But I'll use your appeal to authority here in terms of the founders versus the framers. The founders, as you said, the people who believed in freedom, and as you learned in this debate, was a very different group of men than those who were the framers and the signers of the Constitution, with an overlap of only 6 out of those 39 signatories of the Constitution who were also there for the signing of the Declaration. But the founders themselves were against a standing army. As they said, from their experience in Europe, militaries defend governments. Militias defend free people. The creation of a standing army and a defense monopoly was a step backwards for safety and a step backwards for freedom, because it makes us more vulnerable to attack, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But if you think about why wars happen, we are lied to from the very beginning when we're taught that wars happen between countries. No, wars are conducted by governments using violence to expand their protection rackets. And when you tell your government, oh, I would love to be a victim of your tyranny, I would love to be part of your defense monopoly, you can take away my rights, you can tax me, as long as you pretend to keep me safe, I will bow down and be a good little tax-paying wage slave citizen. Well, guess what? That's exactly the kind of thing that makes you a target for another government. They would fight a war with your government and take over your country in order to do what? Govern you the way you're being governed now. And I think if the founders were living in Arizona like I am today, they would say that we are the victim of a foreign military occupation from those running the military from Washington, D.C. There is nothing heroic or noble about signing up to kill for politicians. And there's a big difference between warriors and soldiers. A warrior is someone who will put their life on the line to do the right thing. A soldier is someone who volunteers to get paid to kill for government. Yeah, there's some overlap there, but the story of America is the perversion of our warrior class into subservient, bootlicking soldiers. Now, you said we were bombed, describing Pearl Harbor and the people of Hawaii. Now, if we want to protect them and we want to help them, we should be able to. But should we be forced to? Should I be allowed to put a gun to your head and say, give me a third of your income because I need to protect the people of Hawaii? Well, gee, do you really think allowing a system to operate that way is good for freedom? Or is it going to lead to more abuse of power in what we're seeing today and all the other ways that a military makes us less safe in the adventurism that I was personally a part of in Iraq, where as part of the global war of terror set up not to be won but to be perpetuated, we made enemies faster than we could kill them. And I say, we need to stop rapists, right? But do you need government to stop rape? Does government ever stop rape? Do police stop rapes? Do you have a cop in your pocket? No. You ask that woman who lives in an area where she's afraid, is she comforted by the fact that if she gets raped, that she can go to a police department and fill out a form and file a report and have a rape test kit taken? And then, as we see in so many police departments all over America, they're busting people for pot and they're testing drugs, and they have evidence lockers full of untested rape kits. They can't even do the ex post facto accountability right. No, you need freedom if you want to protect from criminality, not government. Because if you want to protect yourself from a rapist, arm yourself. Guns are the great equalizer. If you're not comfortable with a gun, carry pepper spray, carry a taser. And by the way, Jay, you also made another historically false statement, or at least a reality false statement. You say, we have the right to keep and bear arms. I don't. I'm a felon for a victimless crime. The government took that right of mine away because it never was a right. Under a coercive system of government, your rights are turned into privileges, and they're only given lip service as rights. So this is the law of unintended consequences, right? You trust government to protect you from criminality. Well, we're going to take the guns away from criminals. And, you know, when outlaws have guns, or excuse me, when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. When seconds count, the police are just minutes away. So what's the effect? If you really trusted government to stop rape, more rape. That's what you get when you turn to violence to solve problems that are better solved through peaceful cooperation. So, if the government wanted to make, if we really trust the government to fight abortion, and we said the government should pass a law, outline abortion, within a few years, men would be having them. So you talk about IP versus, the intellectual property you have to protect, ideas. That's wrong. Intellectual property is directly contradictory to real property. You can't believe in both consistently. So if you believe in real property, that means that you have the right to do what you want with stuff that you own. If you believe in this nonsense racket framework of intellectual property, you're saying that ideas and the use of ideas and the manipulation of ideas by government can be used as an excuse to violate your real property rights. If you take this to its logical conclusion, government's going to come in and say, well, we own the rights to fire because the guy who first invented fire, he passed it down and granted it to us, and this is a patentable idea, and government owns this idea. Now you have to pay taxes because we own this idea. Absolute nonsense. It is unethical to use violence in violation of individual rights to impede the free flow of ideas. You talk about the inevitability of government because it's natural, and then you did that right after talking about rape. You say that natural equals good. Hello, rape is natural. Murder is natural. That doesn't make it good. That doesn't mean it's something that we shouldn't fight with everything we can to stop. The idea that, yes, there are people who will always try to take advantage of other people, and oftentimes they will use the institution of government to do it, doesn't mean that we should just give up and say, well, we'll just accept that we'll always have some form of coercive government. And again, you go to currencies. Competing currencies are a bad thing? No, come on. We can have standardization and agreement without uniformity being forced on us. Competing currencies are a lot better than currency monopolies, because currency monopolies are what we have today. But again, Jay, except for your vague assertion that government has a general deterrent effect on crime, aside from not accounting for all of its criminal behavior itself, 90%, you just look around the world, be honest, 90% of the violence in the world is committed in the name of governments. 90% of the criminality of the world, I mean, more than that. If you look at all the money that is moved, all of the lives that are ruined, all of the economic activity that is stifled, all of the freedom that is taken, 99+% of the criminality in the world today is done in the name of governments. And I don't think you have done anything to make the case for the purposes of this debate to show that the Constitution has actually done anything meaningful to increase freedom.
Well, and I think to a certain extent on that particular point, we may have to, just because we haven't gotten to the other two yet, which of course, not saying that accusatory, that's also partially me as well. We've been going back and forth on this for a while, right? But
get the other two real quick in here.
Yeah. So, and just to kind of reiterate for the people, so we kind of just finished on that one with with me claiming that law is required for certain aspects of liberty to be maintained, and with Mr. Kokesh saying that law, if it is grounded in criminality, does not actually maintain any sort of liberty. And of course, you guys are free to do that determination, to determine, with that information what you like. So the next point I wanted to make, the separation of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, right? And I know there are many legal scholars out there who would like to do that very thing, right? So just briefly, you did mention with the Old Testament and the New Testament as far as their compilations and stuff like that. I do just want to briefly point out that there's a lot of religious myths in the world that I think certainly do need to be addressed, and obviously not to get too derailed into that, but just to point out just one thing as a perfect example. All but 7 of the books of the Bible have been found almost in their complete forms, because of course certain fragments go missing over time because of the wear and tear of erosion and all that kind of stuff. Before Constantine was even born. So and we have a set 27 book canon about 200 years before Constantine is born. via the religious scholars Irenaeus and Origen. Now, why do I point that out? Well, because to a very real extent, what we have a lot of times here is these, people for numerous different reasons, and then their ideas get passed on to other people who then take it without these reasons, right? But for usually agenda-driven reasons, people do try to separate certain things that are obviously existing in context with one another. Now, of course, can there be separate groups who decide that this new edition is not something they want to accept? Like, for example, you pointed out Jews. Absolutely. And there were anti-federalists at the time of the signing of the United States Constitution who were, we like the Declaration of Independence. We are not okay with the United States Constitution. And of course, those people certainly exist in that sense. But to say the people who do affirm the Constitution can separate the Constitution from the Declaration of Independence, they are just being historically inaccurate. Thomas Jefferson, the very man who penned the Declaration of Independence, was making perfectly clear that he believed the Constitution codified what he had written down so that it could actually be enacted in real life.
Okay, so if I may, Jay, this isn't really a critical point to my case that the Constitution is anti-freedom. I could grant your point and it wouldn't change the conclusion if it was the same people. Hey, maybe it was the same exact 100 people sat down and wrote the Declaration and led the war and then created the Constitution. Well, they could have screwed up. It doesn't. To me, and I would hope to your own sense of logic and reason, this historical case that you're making that there was some continuity of thought between the two documents still doesn't make the case in any meaningful way that the Constitution has had a positive effect for freedom.
Well, I think it does in context with the conversation that we've had, and let me kind of explain why. I think if the people who are putting forward these ideas of freedom are saying that this is the best way to codify that freedom that they had suggested, I think it's at least worth a look. If we can couple that with the fact that, as I've said before, I think that we do need some semblance of law, right? Then I think we do have a very real case here for saying, because, we keep using words here like, for example, criminality.
Okay, so this is still, but you're still, hold on, Jay, you're still making the logical fallacy of the appeal to authority that because these people fought it, then we should give it a second look. Well, we gave it a second look. We gave it a lot of tries, and we got to look at the results. And the crux of this debate is not the intent of the founders or the hopes of the founders or whether or not the founders and the framers were the same people or how dishonest were the framers about their intentions when they said to create a more perfect union when they really meant to create a central bank and a strong government authority. That doesn't matter to the debate. Did it have an effect of freedom or not?
Well, actually, you used the central bank example. I could give three pretty interesting historical examples from that. So first off, Jefferson himself said that he thought that was one of the strongest points of the Constitution was that it fought against the central bank, and gave the right for coinage rather strictly to the Congress rather than to some unaccountable entity.
That was the authorization. To say that the Constitution prevented a central bank is historically inaccurate based on what you just said, because what it did is it gave Congress the power to coin money and to borrow in the American people's name, which has led us to the Federal Reserve System today, which, as I understand historically, is actually the third central bank of America after we got rid of two others. And this central authority, or this bank is authorize it. It's constitutional for the U.S. government to do business with it. So no, what you just said is absolutely not historically realistic.
Well, hang on, because there's a few things there. Notice, first off, you pointed out that there are three separate historical central banks in our nation's history, right? None of those were original. Alexander Hamilton argued for the first one, and as much as I admire Washington, this is one of his flaws. He actually agreed with it. Then eventually that ended up not being the case. I think it was either Lincoln or Jackson. I can't remember which one, but either Lincoln or Jackson got rid of the central bank. We eventually established another one.
Jackson killed the bank.
It was Jackson, yeah. And to be fair, that I will grant you that, that's a perfect example of not necessarily being able to trust men, because Washington was a much better man than Jackson, and yet Jackson has the right idea there. My opinion, of course, but, only one of them, I think, committed a genocide.
Well,
I'm not aware of
in this case, if all of your there's a lot of genocide wrapped up in this that kind of defeats these historical justifications. But oh man, wow, okay. Yeah, if you want to talk about the central banks, as this thing that the Constitution was against, I don't buy it at all. Because Hamilton was hugely behind the creation of the central bank, and without the central government, there would be no enforcement of the central bank's ability to have monopoly money creation powers in the first place. People would have been able to opt out and use their own money. And because Congress had that power and created the legal tender laws, they created a money monopoly. Monopolies by force are, by definition, anti-freedom.
See, but I think there's a couple things that need to just be understood historically. When we say that the Constitution is a bulwark against the banking system, I mean, let's remember when we finally had a permanent set up Federal Reserve system was 1913, which is 124 years after.
Did you just call it permanent?
Well, it is right now, at least. You know what I mean? Obviously, we can try and get. I mean, don't get me wrong. If we remove it, we remove it. Nobody's decided they want to do so far, and I would argue honestly at this point, unfortunately,
I want to do so.
Well, I understand that.
But I mean, want freedom with money, not tyranny with money.
And I completely agree. But my point there is, I think me and you both, and anybody who would agree with us on that, because I mean, even guys like Rick Perry, who I think we would both disagree with on a lot of things. Even he's down with getting rid of the Federal Reserve. But the thing is the majority of Americans, for some odd reason, are not okay with it right now. I don't know why. I think it's a flaw in logic. But the point being that it wasn't until 1913 we had the Federal Reserve Act passed, and that we've had to deal with it now for the last 107 years. That's 124 years of no federal. And in fact, remember, they even had to change the Constitution in order to tax you individually, because the Constitution originally said that it could take a certain percentage of the general incomes of the states themselves, thus giving the local communities the ability to tax themselves, right? So the Constitution was even a bulwark against, and now, of course, all taxation is theft. I do agree with that, but some evils in this world, unfortunately, need to be maintained. They have to happen. For example, we point out that,
evil is necessary.
I just firmly disagree.
But you said had to be maintained. Really? You think human beings should be in the business of maintaining evils, even if somehow necessary by fact of nature? Isn't it part of humanity, in our very nature, our essence, to fight against evil, not maintain it?
Well, yes and no. I'll give you a perfect example, right? The Second Amendment I absolutely love and adore. However, the Second Amendment exists because of a known evil that will always exist, and that is people, whether it's governments, foreign invaders, criminals, doesn't matter, people trying to take your liberty. We cannot do anything about that. It will be until the end of time. And so what we have decided is we have decided to give you the right to take somebody's life, which is evil. That is an absolute evil.
No, hold on. You don't give someone a right. Rights are inherent. As you said, they're God-given. You just contradicted yourself. Did you not hear that?
Fair enough. Definitely a semantic issue on my part. I'll grant you that. Not the point that I was trying to get forward. But what I am saying is that we have acknowledged, I'll use the word acknowledge, we acknowledge the right to defend yourself, to take another man's life, right? Which I would argue, taking a man's life is always evil. It just so happens that that man doing something else that is of greater evil justified your evil. But it's not right to take human life. Taking human life is evil always. However, what else are you going to do, right? He's coming out trying to attack.
I think certainly in Christian ethical doctrine, there can be righteous taking of life. If it's in self-defense, if it's absolutely necessary to stop a greater evil, then that is not an evil thing. It might have bad elements, but it is inherently good and not evil then.
I think I would completely fundamentally disagree. There's certainly philosophers who would agree with you, but I would appeal to if we were to use the Christian ethic, appeal to the Constitution itself. Jesus himself made very clear that to even call a man a fool, to have anger against another man, so on and so forth, was to be guilty of hellfire crimes. In fact, the point of the New Testament is to say that basically everybody is guilty of hellfire crimes, which is why you should be understanding of other people.
Sure,
at
but
least if
you
we
can kill but you can kill someone in self-defense without being angry. You can kill someone being rational, and if you're doing it in a good, justified way, it's not based on hate. It's based on love and defense.
But do you think that would be something that, in other words, so it's hard to kind of get all the terms in line with what I'm trying to say. So we know in a perfect world that no death would be occurring in that, at least in that sense. Obviously, in a perfect world, we probably still age, but let's just assume, evil death as far as people killing each other and stuff like that. We would assume that wouldn't happen in a perfect world, right? We have decided as a society, and I think this is as a result of acknowledging what is just inherent fact, that certain things, like, for example, the taking of life is wrong. Some people feel so strongly, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're one of these people, feel so strongly about this that they don't even eat meat, right?
Right. Well, I'll eat it, but I don't purchase it I won't kill an animal to eat it or pay for someone to do it if it's not essential to my health or survival.
Absolutely. So once again, that's an example of, we have this inherent in us, and we have acknowledged it as a society, but inherent in humanity, regardless of if we acknowledge it as a society, this idea that life is to be preserved, right? And in fact, I would argue it's the most fundamental of all ideas that we have ever had, and it's the most absolute of all morals that we actually affirm, because it's the one moral that every human being on the planet agrees with. If you find somebody who disagrees, all you got to do is put a gun to their head real quick, and they will very quickly agree. You know what I mean? And so when you acknowledge that, what you're saying is there are instances when it is okay to violate the most fundamental of all morals, at least in my own opinion. But once again, I think this is something that basically everybody would have to accept, because, I mean, without life, what does liberty even mean? Without life, who cares if you're happy? Without life, righteousness doesn't matter. You know what I mean? So on and so forth. And yet we have instances, whether it's the killing of animals for foodstuffs, whether it's the taking of somebody's life for breaking into your home, whether it's warfare, things like that, where we have decided, and in some instances rationally so, in some instances I would argue not, but we have decided that it is okay to take life. And what I would say is, because of the fact that we don't live in this perfect world that I started this little soliloquy on with, right, that unfortunately certain evils are necessary to protect from greater evils. Taking a life, for example, is necessary to prevent starvation, or to prevent somebody killing you, or maybe to prevent somebody from committing heinous crimes, like, for example, killing a serial killer at the law. And I would argue it goes even farther than that. I would say lying is evil, but if it's lie to the Nazi or expose the Jew, then that particular evil is justified by virtue of a greater evil being the alternative. But the dilemma only works if both things are acknowledged to be evil.
I think you're using evil and bad incorrectly, interchangeably here. But as to this necessity that you say, I think you're very narrow-minded in your analysis and not thinking outside of the box at all, which means that you have allowed your thinking to be corralled by the box of the establishment here. And just as one example, you said that, sometimes it will always be necessary to kill someone to stop them, and, or to put them to death, or whatever. And technology proves that that's not the case. I support firearms rights because they're essential human rights and the right to self-defense. But as a libertarian, I want to see the creation and maximization and preservation of value as well. And when I carried a firearm, when I was legally allowed to, when my privilege was respected by the U.S. government, I also carried a pepper spray at all times. I thought it was irresponsible to carry a firearm without carrying some other device that allows you to escalate force before going to deadly force in stopping someone. And that would allow you to be more useful, that you can, in certain situations, you got a drunk guy who's just, you got a drunk guy who's breaking windows. Do you really want to shoot that guy? Do you really want, is it really worth, is it like, if you're the business owner and you're feeling threatened, or you're in a home and there's a drunk guy breaking your windows, like he's coming in, yeah, you're justified in defending your property because it's a threat to your life when someone is coming at you like that with whatever force necessary. But is that good for society? Is that good for the world? Is it good for freedom? Absolutely not. And we already have the non-lethal technology that would address that situation. Do we ever have to put anyone to death to protect society? Absolutely not, in a world where we have reliable prison systems, where we can know with pretty close to absolute certainty that if you lock someone up, they're not just going to escape and commit more crimes. We are about to have even better non-lethal technology where we are going to be able to zap someone from a distance. I mean, the tasers that cops have are already, way better than anything we had even just a few years ago with their ability to disable someone. And they're actually more effective than guns in self-defense in some situations, right? If you're in a fight with someone, you're wrestling, physical fight, and you have a gun and you have a taser, and you get to draw one, and you know that if you draw the gun, you could miss. You could hit the guy in the foot, and he's just going to be really pissed off. But if you shoot him in the toe with the taser, the guy's going to be just as disabled as if you shot him in the face. And when that technology gets to be as effective projectile-wise as firearms, then you're not going to want a firearm. You're never going to be justified because we don't have because we don't have better tools, because we will have better tools. You will never be justified in taking someone's life in self-defense with a firearm when you are more capable of stopping them with something that is non-lethal. So that's just one example, Jay, but I think a lot of these assertions that you're making are simply accepting the limitations of thought imposed by the current paradigm and really not looking at accurate reality. You said that you had some rhetorical issues, and I would be happy to grant you the points that you're making, but I think the rhetorical confusion is indicative of a confused perspective. And the Dalai Lama was once asked, what's the first thing you would do if he was president? And he said, I would start calling things by their proper names. And this is not part of the quote, this is me applying that principle then. Taxation is theft. War is murder, politicians are criminals, government is a racket, and the Constitution is the anti-freedom document that gives people the excuse to use government to violate individual rights.
Well, and I think with that, looks like it's about 3:42, so I do want to kind of wrap up a little bit. So I guess the last thing, because I do kind of want to
Jay, I think, thank you. No, that's good. I want to give you the last word in the debate, and I promise no more rebuttals. I think I've had a little more time than you, but this has been a lot of fun. It's been a really good, healthy back and forth. I've learned from your perspective. I hope you've learned a bit from mine, and all of our audience has benefited from the experience. So for the debate, I feel like I've given sufficient closing remarks. I would like to let you have the last word in the debate itself.
For sure. Well, and I do appreciate that. And obviously, I do appreciate your cordiality in all this. Obviously, this has been certainly a very respectful debate. It's been an informative debate. I think those are very important, considering the fact that a lot of people are taking their cues from how to debate from the presidential debates, and I'm sure you get my drift when I say that. So it's nice to see returns to actual dialogue. I absolutely respect that for sure. I guess I would simply wrap up in saying that I do believe that for all of the flaws the United States has had, a lot of the great things that has been presented by the United States would not be possible, in my opinion, without the Constitution. Now, if that is not the case, if it turns out that in an alternate universe, a vicious fascist America was just as luxuriously, prosperously gifted as we were, then I guess that had something to do with something that was not the government, right? But if that's not the case, and if that alternate universe wouldn't exist, then I guess, and I guess there's no way for me to necessarily know that at this current point in time. But nonetheless, I appreciate the conversation. I'd kind of leave it on that little fun anecdote. And also, I would also like to say, because we've now had two conversations. I'm not sure if you remember the first one. It was April 10th of 2019. They've both actually been quote unquote adversarial. I only say that in the sense that we had opposing views, but
intellectually.
Exactly. Intellectually, for sure. Would you at all be willing to come on for like a sort of just a dialogue on the things we agree about, actually, on the show proper?
Absolutely.
Talk like police brutality and government overreach, militarization, victimless crimes. I mean, the fact that you can't carry a firearm over a victimless crime is absolute nonsense. It's a travesty of justice. But yeah, so I mean, would you be willing to do something like that?
Absolutely. And Jay, if I may suggest, we could focus on localization, because as much as we might disagree over anything as Americans, localization should be the one thing that we can unite on, because it means everybody gets what they want with government localized down to the community level. If you want to live under the U.S. Constitution, then you can have a community of people who all agree to submit to that authority. If somebody else wants to live in a white nationalist state, hey, I'm not going to live there, but let them, if they want to have that, they don't force it on anybody. Gun-grabbing socialists want to have a nudist commune in the woods. Let them have that. We can all agree to respect each other's rights as individuals and communities to choose to be a part of whatever system we want. And so I would love to come on and use that as a way to talk about all the things that even you and I agree with particularly, but that we can unite Americans on more broadly. And with that, I'll just close with my website plug. If I get, there it is on camera, thefreedomline.com. You can get my book Freedom there for free in every digital format, including audiobook, and I'm sure Jay will include it in the notes. Again, thank you for the opportunity, brother. And anybody watching this, share this video, please. I think this has been a fun and important conversation for our fellow Americans to be a part of right now, but just as importantly, to support independent media and what Jay is doing with modern day debate. So thank you for making this happen, both Jay and to your wonderful audience.
And thank you as well. We obviously always appreciate larger figures coming onto the program. It's not, obviously you don't want everything to turn into a publicity stunt, but at the same time, independent media does need help from its big brothers. So I very much appreciate it. And with that, we are out of here, friends. I want to say shalom to you all. This has obviously been a very good program here today. If you guys want to go into the link in the description here in my video, you will find links to all of my different social media websites, as well as, or accounts rather, as well as to Adam Kokesh's YouTube channel and website. We'll also be providing some links in the description to certain things of Mr. Kokesh's, which I very much would endorse. For example, that book, Freedom. You absolutely should read it. It's a very good read. Nonetheless, have fun, guys, and, live long and prosper, as they say.
Peace and love, y'all.
Indeed.
All right, give me a second, and I'll